I think sometimes we overcomplicate something that essentially was created to be so simple. Reading out of the book of Matthew, chapter 22, verse 34 through 40. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question: "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." In this very text, we see that the religious teachers of that time come to Jesus and they come to test him. And they say, "Jesus, which is the greatest, or what are the greatest commandments of the law?" To the 600 and something laws, Jesus, what are the greatest commandments? And Jesus summarized our faith in two commandments. He says, you are to love God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, with all your strength. And the second thing is you're to love your neighbor as yourself. So sometimes we overcomplicate it, but Jesus simplified it. In our spirituality, the thing that we must be doing as believers is we must love God. Well, what does that mean? Well, if we love God, we understand that we're creating space for God in our lives. We're spending time with Christ. We're abiding in Him in us, and our life is bearing fruit. We also know that Jesus said, if you love me, then you'll obey me. So we also know that the love language of heaven is obedience. So we recognize that in our faith, one of the things that we need to do to demonstrate our love to Jesus is obedience. So we get that down. Love God. And then the second thing that Jesus said is you are to love your neighbor as yourself. Well, then he begins to go further and he says, well, who is my neighbor? And Jesus begins to break down this idea of who his neighbor is. And we later come to realize that his neighbor is his enemy. The Bible also says when we didn't know God, we were once enemies of God. So we kind of understand that who is Jesus calling us to love? Jesus is calling us to love the lost. Jesus is calling us to love people who are far away from Him. That is what Jesus is calling us to do. And I believe that us as believers, we have a duty. And one of the confirmations is that I'm sitting in my living room and I'm scrolling through my cell phone and I'm going through all of my contacts. And I began to realize that every single one of the people in my cell phone were Christians. They were people who were saved. And in that moment, I broke down and I began to cry because here I am, this youth pastor that gets up every week and I tell kids, bring kids to church, bring kids to Jesus. If you bring 5 kids next week, we'll give you a Ferrari. Like whatever it took, we were telling kids to share their faith. But here I was, a pastor, a man of the cloth. And I'm not telling anybody about Jesus. I'm not reaching out. I'm not sharing my faith. And I was broken, friends. And I knew that something needed to change in my life and something needed to change in our spirituality. And I think that sometimes we can get so busy with ministry and get so busy with the day-to-day operations and so busy with work that sometimes we lose sight that the Great Commission is not for others, but the Great Commission is for all of us, that God is calling us to reach out to a lost and a dying world, people who need Jesus. Just like someone shared the gospel narrative with you, we need to do the same. And my thing is there needs to be this holy obligation within us to share our faith. Hey, I'm not telling you to go and change the world. I'm just telling you to go and change your world. John chapter 1, verse 40 through 42. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of the two who heard what John had said and who had followed Jesus. The first thing Andrew did was to find his brother Simon and tell him, we have found the Messiah. That is the Christ. And he brought him to Jesus. The first thing that Andrew did was not go to seminary, was not go to school, was not go to a Bible study. The first thing that Andrew did was he found his brother Peter and he brought him to Jesus. That word brought in the original language has the implication of literally meaning that he picked him up and he carried him to Jesus. He didn't force him into conversion. He didn't force him to say a prayer. He didn't force him to do anything that he didn't want him to, but he simply brought him into a space and where he can discover if this Jesus thing was real and authentic and if this is the one that he had been waiting for. And I think of that passion, and it's so easy to have that passion when we first get saved. It's so easy to have that passion when we first start ministry, but somewhere along the lines, life hits, things come, busyness settles in, and we forget that Jesus is calling us to reach people in our sphere of influence. And my question is what if we really began to think of ourselves from more of a missional standpoint? What if we really began to look at ourselves as missionaries? That maybe missions work isn't confined to 10 days out of the year at $2,300, but maybe missions is 24/7. Maybe missions is all around us. Maybe missions is the moment that we get up. Maybe for some of you, missions is the moment you get out of your bed. But maybe missions is the gym. Maybe missions is your Starbucks. We started our church with this missional mindset. We didn't start our church and people are like, wow, Berto's planning a church. Thousands are going to come to. No, they didn't care who I was. They don't know who I was. We had to begin this missional type of life. And it really challenged us, this Jesus at the well type ministry, making the decision to do life with people who don't know Jesus. And I think for me, I secluded myself from these kinds of people because I had this misconception that if I hung around with maybe people who weren't saved, that maybe I would somehow become like them. And isn't that the very thing that Jesus did? Didn't Jesus dine with the sinners? Didn't Jesus sit at the table with tax collectors? Didn't Jesus invite himself into broken people's homes? And I think that maybe somewhere along the lines, sometimes as the church, we're missing that. Well, maybe Jesus is just calling us to be incarnational. Maybe the truth is you're the only Jesus that your neighbor will ever see. Do we have this holy obligation to want to reach out and bring people into a space in where they can discover who Jesus is? What story is your life telling? When people look at your life, are they seeing Jesus in you? Are they seeing something different, maybe something that is drawing them to Jesus? God has always impressed on me, go after the people that nobody wants, and God will bring you the people that everyone wants. And that has been our focus in our ministry. Whose story are you entering into? Because the truth is, evangelism is really storytelling. We wouldn't even call it evangelism at our church. We call it storytelling. And we say your story matters, so tell it. Maybe God wants to use your story to introduce his story into someone's broken story in order to make it a whole story. The truth is that maybe some of you have experienced some painful, traumatic moments in your life. The truth is that maybe some of you right now are currently experiencing some pain in your life, and I don't know about you, but I know that the thing that God has used the most in my life has been my pain. Sam Chan would argue and say, if you raise the threshold of your pain, you'll raise the level of your influence, and I could not agree with that anymore. You sit down with some of the greatest men and women of God, and you ask them their narrative, and they will always include some sort of pain in their life that helped them to get to where they're at, because God uses our pain. And I'm here to tell you that some of us maybe feel that God can't use my pain, that God can't use my brokenness. I minister the best out of my brokenness. I think that I can minister in the city and in the context that I do because I've been there, I've lived it, I've made the mistakes, and now I live with the people, and now I can minister from a place of where I comprehend things because I've had to go through the things that they're currently experiencing. So sometimes we think our pain, God can't use our children who aren't walking with Jesus. God can't use our situation. God can't use a broken marriage. God can't use, God will use all of it. And I guarantee you that if you allow God, he'll use more of your pain than anything. Maybe God wants to use you to be the Band-Aid to someone else's wound. So maybe today God is calling you to enter into someone's story. And maybe he's calling you to enter into someone's pain. As if we all did our part, I couldn't imagine what heaven is going to look like. I don't know about you, but I have this passion in me to take as many people with me as I can to the greatest vacation that will last forever in eternity with Jesus called heaven. It's who I am. It's what I just want to take as many people as I can with me. And I think sometimes we're afraid. You can't be afraid of your story. You can't be afraid of the story that Jesus has given you. You can't be afraid of the redemptive story that Jesus has given you. I know I can't. Saved me from a lifestyle of cocaine and drug addiction in the fashion industry, drug overdose 2 times, left to die, and here I am ministering the gospel. Man, I've been forgiven much, therefore I love much. And I want to take as many people with me. And that's the power of us loving God and loving people, entering into people's stories, entering into people's pains, watching walls come down, and speaking the truth in love.